The chamber of the Galactic Council shimmered with light refracted through crystalline walls, a display meant to awe and intimidate in equal measure. Rows of alien delegates filled the tiers, their voices a constant susurrus of discontent, hisses, trills, and guttural tones blending into a storm of disapproval. At the center of it all stood Elias Cade, the sole human present, his tall frame straight as a lance, his expression carved from iron. He neither bowed nor fidgeted beneath the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. He simply waited, still and silent, as he had learned to do during the long years of soldiering before his reluctant turn to diplomacy. Ambassador Varen, the presiding elder, lifted his segmented hands to quiet the hall. His voice carried the brittle calm of authority that had been wielded too long. Humanity has become a matter of contention. Too ambitious, too adaptable, too dangerous. We have reached a conclusion. His faceted eyes swept the chamber, lingering on Elias, as if daring him to interrupt. Elias did not. A delegate with tendrils coiling in agitation rose and barked. Their fleets patrol half the frontier. They impose their order, not our collective will. This is not cooperation, it is dominion. Another, scales glinting beneath the chamber lights, added. They take barren worlds and make them habitable within decades. Their colonies spread faster than ours. Their inventions disrupt our balance. Even their wars, brief as they are, leave scars. Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard it all before, dressed in different words but poisoned with the same envy and fear. The Council saw humanity's drive as a threat, not as the offering it had always been. He thought of the relief fleets dispatched to starving worlds, the soldiers who bled on borders not their own, the engineers who shared discoveries without demanding tribute. All of it was forgotten, discarded beneath the weight of suspicion. Varen raised his voice again. The vote has been cast. Humanity's membership is revoked. Effective immediately, human ships, soldiers, and envoys will withdraw from Council-controlled space. Humanity will no longer possess the rights or protections of this body. The proclamation rang like a gavel strike. Murmurs surged, some relieved, some uneasy. Elias stepped forward at last, his boots echoing against the polished floor. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and resonant, cutting through the dissonant noise. We asked for partnership, not dominion. We fought beside you, not above you. We shared what we knew, not because we sought chains in return, but because cooperation seemed wiser than isolation. His eyes scanned the tiers, meeting stares that darted away under the weight of his gaze. If you judge our resilience as arrogance, our determination as tyranny, then we cannot change that. You wish us gone. He let the silence linger, taut as drawn steel. Then gone we shall be. No anger colored his tone, no pleading. Just weariness, resignation, and something else that unsettled the delegates more than any threat could have, finality. Elias inclined his head with soldierly precision, then turned his back on the council without waiting for dismissal. The silence he left behind was heavier than any applause or jeer. From the upper tiers, Councillor Tarvek watched with narrowed reptilian eyes. Where others saw a dangerous relief, he saw a fracture in the foundation. Elias's calm departure gnawed at him. A species that raged could be controlled, provoked, or crushed. But a species that left without a word, without even a clenched fist raised, that species carried something the Council had not accounted for. As Elias strode from the chamber, he allowed himself a final thought, not spoken aloud but etched into his resolve. Humanity would not crawl for scraps of validation. They would not beg to be included in a council that had chosen to blind itself. They would walk away, as quietly as possible, and let the galaxy discover on its own what had been lost. Behind him, the chamber erupted again in debate, voices clashing over justifications, assurances, and fears thinly veiled as triumph. None of it mattered. The decision had been made, and the weight of it would rest not on human shoulders, but on the galaxy's. Elias reached the great doors and paused only long enough to cast one last glance at the chamber. His face betrayed nothing, but deep within, an ember of conviction burned. Humanity did not need the Council. The Council, though, would come to realize in time how much it needed humanity. And with that thought, he walked into the echoing corridors beyond, footsteps steady, unhurried, final. The chamber doors sealed behind him, and for the first time in its long history, the Council trembled at silence. The withdrawal began without spectacle, without the flare of defiance that many of the Council members had anticipated. Human ships departed their stations in perfect order, fleets peeling away from border patrols and defense lines like disciplined shadows retreating from the light. Colonies once nurtured by human hands fell silent as engineers, doctors, and builders gathered their tools and left behind the worlds they had once raised from barren rock. The act was deliberate, precise, and carried out with the same unshakable efficiency that had always unsettled their peers. Captain Marcus Hale stood at the viewport of the flagship Resolute, watching the last of his squadron accelerate toward Seoul. His face bore the hard lines of a man carved by campaigns and tempered by the endless pressure of command. "That's the last of them," he said quietly, not needing to check his consoles. He had memorized the schedule down to the second. Behind him, officers worked in silence, their usual easy camaraderie replaced by a weight they dared not voice. "They'll notice the holes soon enough," murmured a second, a lean veteran named Darrow. "Trade routes open to pirates, colonies without healers, frontiers without guards. They'll call it freedom today, but in weeks they'll call it neglect." Hale's lips thinned in something that wasn't quite a smile. "And by then, we'll be gone too far for them to reach." His gaze lingered on the stars where human patrols had once flown. "They wanted us gone. So we leave." On dozens of worlds, the departure was witnessed by alien civilians who had grown used to the presence of humans, the soldiers who patrolled dangerous districts without complaint, the engineers who could coax stubborn reactors into obedience, the doctors who worked without rest until plague wards were emptied. For them, the silence left in humanity's wake was more unsettling than any threat. Ships lifted off, engines roaring into the skies, and those who remained behind realized too late that comfort had come not from council decrees, but from the quiet labor of the very species now turning its back. Elias Cade returned to Earth aboard a smaller diplomatic vessel, his posture rigid as ever, though his eyes betrayed the fatigue of a man who had carried more than one burden too long. He watched the blue marble swell in the viewport, a sight both familiar and newly precious. When Marcus Hale's face appeared on the comm screen, the two men studied each other in silence before Elias spoke. "They celebrated, you know," Elias said. His voice was flat, but Hale knew the weight beneath it. Relief filled their chamber like a toxin. "They believe they've solved a problem." Hale inclined his head slightly. "They will see soon enough that they've only created one." A pause followed, heavy with the unspoken truth between them. Humanity had not been banished in shame. It had chosen dignity in silence. Yet that silence was sharper than steel, and both men knew it would echo through the galaxy long after the Council's cheers faded. Weeks passed, and the effects rippled outward faster than the Council could disguise. Pirate flotillas raided trade lanes that human destroyers once secured. Epidemics flared in colonies that had relied on human antivirals. Infrastructure projects stalled as human engineers withdrew their teams. None of it was accompanied by human gloating or condemnation. Reports simply went unanswered, requests ignored, distress signals met with nothing but static. Inside the council chambers, the tone shifted from smug relief to guarded unease. Delegates whispered of shortages, of rising instability, of fleets stretched too thin. Varen dismissed these concerns with the brittle calm of a man unwilling to admit error. "The galaxy will adapt." Humanity was a crutch, not a necessity, he declared. But his words rang hollow, and those who listened could not ignore the quiet truth gnawing beneath. In contrast, Tarvek said little, but watched much. His calculating mind tallied every absence, every failure, every new scar across the galactic order. He saw clearly what others refused to acknowledge. The Council had not removed a nuisance. They had cast away a keystone. Back on Earth, the mood was one of grim determination rather than despair. Factories that had once supplied the council shifted their production inward. Fleets reorganized, no longer stretched thin across a galaxy that did not want them. Research facilities expanded, turning discoveries once freely shared into guarded secrets. Humanity, long accustomed to proving itself to suspicious allies, now turned its gaze solely toward its own future. In a dimly lit strategy room, Hale leaned over a table filled with star charts, lines of supply now redirected towards Sol and its colonies. Elias stood across from him, arms folded, his voice low. "They'll come to us again. Not today, not tomorrow, but when the holes grow too wide to patch. They'll send envoys, apologies, bargains." Hale's eyes met his, steady as iron. "And what will we do when they do?" Elias let the question hang, his silence more telling than any immediate answer. Finally, he said, "We'll decide then. Not as supplicants, not as exiles, but as equals. Until that day, we remain silent." That silence spread like a shadow across the stars, unnerving allies and adversaries alike. Humanity had walked away without fanfare, without war, without a single shot fired. And yet in that retreat lay a tension far greater than conflict. For absence, when it was deliberate, carried its own kind of power. On distant worlds, alien children asked where the humans had gone. Merchants cursed their absence as trade faltered. Soldiers on the frontiers whispered that the lines felt thinner, colder, more fragile. And in the chambers of power, beneath the bravado and the politics, unease took root. For humanity had left not with fury, but with quiet dignity. And dignity, once denied, did not vanish. It waited. It endured. It warned. The council had demanded humanity's departure, and humanity had obeyed. Yet even in their obedience, there lingered the sharp and unsettling truth. It is not always the loud departure that is most dangerous, but the quiet one. A decade passed, and the council chambers no longer echoed with confidence. Where once the air had been filled with speeches and proclamations, now it sagged with arguments, accusations, and fear. Delegates bickered over shortages, failing borders, and spiraling unrest, their words less like policy and more like desperation. The great alliance that had once stood as a beacon of stability was cracking, and beneath every fracture lurked the same unspoken truth. It had begun the day humanity walked away. Ambassador Varen sat hunched on the central dais, his once bright authority dimmed by years of fraying credibility. He tried to maintain the image of control, but his voice carried little weight, drowned by the rising clamor of discontent. "Order will be restored," he insisted, though the words felt brittle even to him. "We are capable of solving our own problems. Humanity was not the foundation of our strength. We must not indulge nostalgia." The chamber laughed bitterly at that, short, cruel sounds from species who had once trusted the council to guide them. Reports on the central displays told the real story. Pirate lords carving out fiefdoms along the old human patrol routes, once curable plagues killing thousands on colonies abandoned by human medics, industrial stagnation spreading where human engineers had once made machines sing. The galaxy was bleeding, and the bandages kept slipping. Tarvek sat in the shadows of the council tier, arms crossed over his scaled chest. His reptilian eyes flicked from one display to another, tallying every failure with cold precision. He did not speak until the chamber grew loud with accusation and counteraccusation, and only then did his deep voice cut through the din. "You all pretend the wounds are from elsewhere. But we know where the knife was driven. We drove it ourselves." The silence that followed was sharper than the bickering had been. Tarvek leaned forward, the light glinting off his scaled brow. "For centuries, humanity was our shield, our hand, our cure. They fought where we faltered. They built where we hesitated. They gave more than they took. And in our fear, we cast them out." He gestured toward the displays, where red-marked crises spread like cracks across glass. "Now we harvest the fruits of that arrogance." Varen's voice snapped back, thin and defensive. "You speak as though humanity were flawless. They were reckless, disruptive, unchecked." Unchecked. Tarvek's tone was low, dangerous. "They were effective. And now they are gone. The council fell again into uneasy murmurs. Some delegates whispered of reaching out to humanity, of recalling their envoys, of seeking reconciliation. Others balked, too proud to consider admitting their mistake. But the truth had grown undeniable. Their galaxy was weaker without humans. Efforts were made in secret at first. Small delegations were dispatched toward Sol, carrying offers wrapped in diplomacy and apology. None returned. Probes sent to scan the borders of human space vanished without report. Traders who tried to skirt the edges of human territory spoke of silence. No response, no warning shots, no beacons. Just silence. That silence spread deeper unease than any threat. A hostile fleet could be fought. A declaration of war could be answered. But humanity had not declared anything at all. They had folded inward, severed their ties, and turned their gaze entirely upon themselves. To the council, it was as if a fortress had risen overnight, walls higher than sight, gates closed without explanation. And behind those gates, the humans worked, invisible, untouchable. Elias Cade's name surfaced often in whispered meetings. Some remembered his final words before leaving the chamber, the calmness in his voice that had unsettled them more than fury would have. Others speculated that he still lived, guiding humanity's hand from behind its walls. For those who remembered his eyes, steady and unyielding, the thought was enough to keep them awake at night. Pirate incursions grew bolder. Wars that had once been contained by human intervention now spilled unchecked across border systems. Diseases raged, striking especially hard at those who had once leaned on human medicine. Slowly, a new fear replaced the old. No longer did the Council fear humanity's aggression. Now they feared humanity's indifference. Varen, worn down and desperate, convened yet another emergency session. His voice cracked as he tried to hold the chamber together. We must seek them out again. We must re-establish contact. They cannot ignore us forever. But Tarvek only shook his head, scales catching the chamber light. His words carried the gravity of inevitability. You still do not understand. It is not their fist you should fear. It is their silence. For silence means they have no need of us, no desire for us, no concern whether we rise or fall. The chamber grew still, the truth settling like a stone in the stomachs of every delegate. Humanity had not raged when they were cast out. They had not protested, threatened, or fought. They had simply walked away. And now, years later, the galaxy was beginning to feel the weight of that quiet departure. Varen sat slumped in his seat, his voice a whisper meant for no one but himself. Then what is left for us? No one answered. The silence was already reply enough. The sky above the council's capital burned with unfamiliar fire. Vast shapes, sleek and merciless, descended from beyond the edge of known space, their weapons tearing through defenses that had once seemed impregnable. Fleets scrambled to meet them, but the response was fragmented, clumsy, weakened by years of decay. Where once the humans had held the line, there were only gaps, and into those gaps poured the fury of an enemy the Council had never prepared for. Inside the great chamber, chaos reigned. Delegates shouted over one another, panic replacing politics. Varen, old and frail now, sat slumped in his seat, the fire of his once proud authority long extinguished. His voice cracked as he tried to steady them, but no one listened. The Council, that towering edifice of unity, had become a room filled with frightened voices. Only Tarvek remained calm, his reptilian eyes fixed on the displays that showed world after world falling. They are stronger than us, Tarvek said, his voice cutting through the uproar like a blade. They are faster than us. And they are winning. He leaned forward, claws tapping against the desk, each word measured. We cannot stop them. Not alone. Varen's head lifted slowly, his face ashen with the realization that had stalked him for years. We drove away the only people who could have. His words hung heavy in the chamber, dragging the delegates into silence. Shame mixed with fear, and for the first time in decades, not a single voice rose to argue. A decision was made in desperation rather than consensus. An envoy would be sent to Sol, the last hope, the final card in a hand already lost. No one questioned whether humanity still remembered, or whether they would answer. The only question that mattered was whether they would be too late. When the envoy arrived at the edge of human space, the silence was the same as ever. Deep, vast, impenetrable. Their calls went unanswered, their signals drifting into the void. Then, without warning, a formation of human ships appeared, dark as shadows against the stars, their silhouettes unfamiliar yet unmistakably formidable. They dwarfed the envoy's vessel, each line of their hulls radiating purpose, power, and restraint. A channel opened, and the face that appeared was older, but unchanged in its resolve. Elias Cade regarded the envoy with eyes that had lost none of their steadiness, though age had carved deep lines into his features. He did not speak at first, letting silence weigh heavy until the alien ambassador bowed his head and delivered his plea. The council was broken. The galaxy burned. They begged for aid. When the envoy finished, Elias said nothing. Only his eyes flicked aside as another figure stepped into view. Marcus Hale, his presence as commanding as ever, those streaks of gray threaded his hair. He leaned closer, studying the envoy with something colder than anger. "You cast us out," he said. "You feared us. You mocked us. And when we left, you rejoiced. Now you come crawling, asking us to bleed for you again." The envoy stammered, words tumbling out in frantic supplication. Promises of renewed partnership, apologies whispered too late, bargains offered with trembling desperation. Elias raised a hand, silencing the noise. His voice was measured, heavy with the weight of years. "You mistook our silence for surrender. It was never that. It was a choice. We turned inward. We built, we learned, we endured. And while you faltered, we prepared." He leaned closer, and for the first time his calm broke, replaced by the steel of a soldier. "The question is not whether we can save you. It is whether we will." Hale's eyes narrowed as he looked at Elias, his voice low. "Do we answer their knock?" The chamber aboard the human flagship was filled with silence. Officers stood at attention, waiting for a command that might shape the fate of more than one species. Elias studied the envoy, then turned his gaze toward the stars beyond the viewport, where fleets gathered like storms on the horizon. His mind turned to memories of the Council's scorn, of humanity's quiet retreat, of the long years spent forging strength in solitude. The decision weighed heavy, but it was not his alone, it was humanity's. At last, Elias spoke, his words deliberate and final. "We will not fight for their survival. We will fight for our own. If the galaxy endures because of it, then so be it. But they will know, this time, we rise not as servants, not as allies taken for granted, but as a power that chooses its own path." The order was given. Across Sol, fleets powered to life, their engines burning brighter than any star, their weapons systems awakening from years of silence. Ships older council members remembered as formidable now seemed like relics compared to what humanity had become. Lines of steel and fire stretched into the void, formation after formation, a storm uncoiling after decades of restraint. The envoy trembled, awed and terrified. For the first time, they understood the true meaning of the words Elias had spoken long ago. Gone we shall be. Humanity had walked away, but they had never stopped moving forward. As the fleets advanced, Elias turned once more to Hale. Their eyes met, brothers in burden as much as in resolve. Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of inevitability. "We warned them. We showed them. And they chose to ignore us. Now, let them witness what silence has built." The stars ahead lit with the thunder of human engines, and for the first time in centuries, the galaxy trembled not at the thought of humanity's wrath, but at the certainty of their return. "You said,